The United States currently has 423 national park sites, covering every state and landscape imaginable. These parks were created to protect wildlife in their natural habitats and reduce the impact that human activities may cause to them. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee and North Carolina is currently the 19th largest protected green area and is the most visited park in the whole of the United States, attracting over 14 million visitors annually. It is home to over 800 miles of hiking trails, as well as the famous Appalachian Trail, whose mysterious reputation is known worldwide. As the park is 90% forest, there are nearly 20,000 species inhabiting the area, including over 9,000 different insects and 1,500 flowering plant species. Additionally, there are roughly 1,500 black bears that live in the park that are thriving from the protection that the park places upon them. Although these animals are rarely aggressive and usually only approach people out of curiosity, sometimes these bears won't have the best intentions, as Patrick Madura would soon find out. In 2020, 43-year-old Patrick decided that he would go on a solo trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was a trained EMT and firefighter, a man in the prime of his health and a passion for hiking. He arrived at campsite 82 on September 8th and was pleased to see how empty the area was, as it gave him the privacy that he had been looking for. The site was right next to a small creek and was on the edge of a meadow with easy access to lots of trails, so it would be difficult to get lost. He began thinking about his plans for the weekend as he pitched his tent and laid out his sleeping bag. He had been planning this trip for quite a while and was just happy to have some time away from work as the quiet of the wilderness surrounded him. He had arranged to stay for a few days, taking full advantage of the trails around him. He was camped right next to the Hazel Creek Trail, a 25-kilometer hike consisting of numerous creek crossings, overgrown trails, and a variety of wildlife to see. It also connected to many other trails, so he knew he would be able to see a lot of the area over his short stay. As his campsite was one of the more remote, it is known that there would be very few rangers or people around if anything were to go wrong, and you're essentially left to fend for yourself. Although this is what Patrick had in mind when he booked, he had no idea how much he would later come to wish that others were around to save him. A few days after Patrick had settled into the camp on September 11th, another group of campers arrived at campsite 82, ready for their own adventure. When they arrived, they noticed Patrick's tent ominously flapping in the wind, and thinking that this was odd, the group went to investigate. Even if you think that you are completely isolated and are not at any risk of theft, it is still common practice to close up your tent properly, because if you don't, animals may become the robbers instead. The number one rule is to always have your tent closed, so why was this solitary tent wide open in the middle of the day? As they peered inside, they noticed that everything seemed to be in order. The sleeping bag was where you would expect it to be, and all of the belongings were still there. Looking around the tent, they noticed that there was a large area of flattened grass, which only seemed slightly out of the ordinary, as it could have just been from another tent flattening the area down. However, then they noticed the blood along the ground, a gruesome amount of blood. The blood trail led away from the tent towards the creek, and as the group continued to follow the trail, they saw a large bear about 30 feet away in the creek, seemingly eating something. It hadn't even noticed them as it was so engrossed in its meal. Suddenly, one of the hikers stepped on a twig, alerting the bear to their presence. The bear looked directly at the group, and they feared it would approach them. For now, they were safe. The bear was already full from its current meal and turned away. They scrambled away quickly, leaving the campsite to call the authorities as they feared something terrible had happened to the previous camper. Unfortunately, they were in a signal dead zone and had to travel for quite some time before they were able to call anybody. At 7 p.m., they finally spoke to one of the rangers, and they decided to send someone out to investigate the next day. The next morning, a group of investigators arrived at campsite 82 and were horrified by their discovery. They were immediately met by a 240-pound male black bear who was feasting on the dead body of Patrick Madura. Although it was difficult to tell if the corpse was even human at this point, as it had been brutalized beyond recognition, the officers immediately shot the bear dead, knowing that now that it had gotten a taste for human flesh and no longer feared humans, he would become an imminent risk to themselves and future campers. Upon the bear's death, they approached Patrick's body and tried to decide what had happened. As his body was in such poor condition, they collected his remains and sent it to the coroner's office for further analysis, an investigation which would take over a year to get the results back and shed some light on the final moments of the bear's victim. From the coroner's report, this is what we can assume happened to this unfortunate man. While Patrick was sleeping in his tent on September 9th, a hungry bear began patrolling the area searching for food. Coming across the tent, he smelled prey within and pushed his head into the entrance, grabbing Patrick by his legs and pulling him into the open. This would have woken the man up, bewildered and scared in the darkness. As he began to realize what was happening, it would have already been too late as he lay on his back facing a giant black bear. The animal would have used his massive body to smash down onto Patrick, shattering his ribs before beginning to bite and claw at Patrick's face and neck. There were lacerations across his hands and legs, suggesting that he was fighting back hard using all of his training as a firefighter to survive. He would have been terrified feeling his own body being slowly ripped apart, feeling the hot breath of the bear on his body and knowing he would never be able to overpower this huge animal. When the bear realized that his prey was fighting for his life, he locked his jaws onto Patrick's skull and bit down hard. He had already suffered from massive puncture wounds across his whole body, and now the bear finally won his battle with Patrick, perishing from the final bite to the head which broke his skull. Once he was dead, the bear had pulled his body from the campsite to the creek to feast in privacy and to reduce the risk of any other bear coming to fight him for his kill. A truly horrific death for someone who just wanted a weekend break in nature. These attacks in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park are very rare, with only 61 people being fatally wounded by black bears in the last 120 years. Patrick's death was only the second death recorded by a bear in the area's history, the only other being 50-year-old Glenda Ann Bradley, who made national news as the first person killed by a black bear in the Smokies. There have been other attacks in the past which luckily had a happier ending, but with over 50 bears euthanized due to malnutrition, we may see an increase in these kinds of attacks as the animals become desperate to end their starvation. The parks have made many statements to try and ensure that their visitors are kept safe, encouraging people to be aware of their surroundings, travel in groups, and teaching people the correct way to hide their food. The best way to survive is prevention, to avoid any contact with these animals from happening, and how to survive if you are approached. These bears are simply searching for food in a constantly diminishing area of land that is failing to feed them, so they are forced to search for food in other regions that they would normally avoid. Bear sightings in residential areas are slowly increasing as they venture out of their habitats, but as long as people keep their distance, they should be able to avoid the same events that Patrick Madura endured, leading up to his final affliction.
Yellowstone National Park is not only home to a wide array of wildlife, but also bubbling hot springs, towering mountains, and crystal clear lakes. It boasts of over 500 geysers, with the famous Old Faithful geyser shooting a plume of steam and hot water high up to the sky. The park also boasts of over 200 hiking trails that usually burst with color as wildflowers bloom in the spring, creating a stunning display of natural beauty. It is a place of unparalleled beauty that every hiker dreams of setting foot in. And thus, it was no surprise that on the 28th of July 1984, Swiss national Brigitta Fredenhagen, together with her brother and sister-in-law, headed to the park, expecting a fun-filled family outing. The trio was excited to be there. They spent the first 2 days camping and watching the geysers at the Norris Geyser Basin. However, Brigitta wanted to quench her thirst for seeing the famous Yellowstone bears, and so on the second day, Ranger James Youngblood handed Brigitta her camping permit for Site 5B1 on the Broad Creek Trail in Pelican Valley. The ranger reminded her of how wild the bears of Yellowstone Park were, and warned her against traveling alone on the trails or keeping food in her tent. That evening, the trio talked about their plans for the next day. They would hike 6 miles to the Astringent Creek Bridge, from where Brigitta would proceed alone to campsite 5B1. After camping alone for 1 night, she would then hike to the Grand Canyon, where she would meet her brother and sister-in-law. The morning came, and the trio, sticking to their plan, made their way to Astringent Creek Bridge. Along the way, they saw a large placard warning of the untamed wilderness within the Yellowstone backcountry. At the junction of Astringent Creek and Broad Creek, Brigitta's brother and her sister-in-law gave her a quick hug and watched as she disappeared into the winding hiking trail. After months of saving every penny for the trip, here was Brigitta hiking alone. It was happening. She couldn't help but feel a sense of freedom and joy wash over her. She stood, taking in deep breaths of the crisp countryside air as the gusting wind whipped through her hair. The experience was exhilarating. She felt alive and free, her responsibilities left in Switzerland. Yellowstone was now hers to conquer. Aware of high bear activity, she knew the key to avoiding a bear encounter was by creating lots of noise. She tied 2 bear bells on her backpack, which would create a tingling noise to scare away any bears on her trail route to camping site 5B1. The Pelican Valley offers a relatively lush plant growth of sages, forbs, and grass. It is the ultimate bear's paradise, and Brigitta was there to witness the bears in their untamed nature. Nothing could stop her now. She pressed on with a smile on her face and a spring in her step. A few hours into her hike, Brigitta was attracted to the sound of running water. She had arrived at White Lake. Here, she found campsite 5W1, which was empty. She was only 3.5 miles away from her designated campsite 5B1 at Broad Creek, but her feet were burning from fatigue. The thought of venturing further alone in her exhausted state was unpleasant to her, so she made camp at White Lake campsite 5W1. She made dinner as she watched the sun sink below the horizon. After dinner, she found 2 pine trees 85 feet from her campsite. She climbed up and strung a rope between the 2 and hung her food. She then changed into blue pajama pants, took out her journal and scribbled, "I have taken all the precautions." Brigitta then got into her sleeping bag with her head near the door of the tent. She placed a flashlight on one of her sides and a cassette player on the other. The dark clouds gathering above Yellowstone finally gave in. The gentle pitter-patter of the rain on her green domed tent pulled her into a peaceful state. She curled up tighter in her sleeping bag for warmth. As the rain poured, she drifted further and further away, her dreams voyaging her on journeys far beyond the bounds of Yellowstone Park. Outside, the winds howled as lightning illuminated the darkness, casting brief shadows of the tree trunks. But she remained undisturbed, lost in the sweet embrace of her sleep. Brigitta didn't notice as a shadow emerged from the woods. A grizzly bear cautiously approached the tent, tasting the air as it lumbered closer. The smell of a possible meal drew it closer to the tent, where the 24-year-old Brigitta was peacefully resting. It stood on its hind legs with its claws drawn and ready. With a single swipe, it tore down the tent from top to bottom on the right side of the door. The grizzly then stuck its head into the tent, and with a single bite, grabbed Brigitta by her head, sticking its fangs into her face and skull. It pulled her out of the tent, crushing her jawbone in the process. She screamed in pain, trying to free herself as the bear dragged her away into the cold, dark night. At 3:30 p.m. the next day, Brigitta's brother and sister-in-law were waiting at their meeting point on the trail. They had known her to be time-conscious, and so as the minutes passed by, they grew nervous. Soon, minutes turned to hours, and their feelings grew to fear. Something is not right, they thought to themselves. They hurriedly rushed to the Fishing Bridge Visitor Center, where they informed the ranger on duty that Brigitta had not shown up. The ranger immediately issued a missing hiker alert in the park. At 8:15 p.m., the alert of a missing hiker finally got to the ranger manning Pelican Valley, who instantly embarked on a search mission. The ranger patrolled the valley, and by 11:30 p.m. his efforts were fruitless. Throughout the night, the rangers kept an eye on the hiking trails with hopes that Brigitta would finally show up. The clocks were striking 7 in the morning, more than 12 hours after Brigitta was reported missing, when Ranger Marshall was dispatched on a horseback to trace her. Marshall followed Brigitta's hiking route, and at White Lake, he saw a green tent with a red sleeping bag outside the tent. To him, this was odd since campsite 5W1 hadn't been booked recently. He immediately got off the back of his horse to investigate the site. He noticed a large tear on the right side of the tent's door. On peeking inside, he found her hiking gear intact. 85 feet from the tent was a bag hanging from 2 pine trees, just as Brigitta had done 2 nights ago. The bag was ripped apart with its contents scattered on the ground. Not far from the campsite, Ranger Marshall found a human lip, muscle tissue, and hair with a scalp attached to it. He immediately radioed the other rangers of his findings and continued his search for Brigitta. Rangers Tim Blank and David Sprites arrived at campsite 5W1 in a helicopter armed with loaded shotguns to aid in the search. The 3 followed a trail of Brigitta's body parts to the north of the campsite. At about 10 meters from the campsite, the trail of carnage led to a small patch of grass that had pieces of tattered blue clothing and lots of human tissue. It was here that the bear had stopped dragging Brigitta by her head and began feeding on her. Due to the heavy downpour, the rangers had a rough time tracing the bear's steps, but after hours of tracking, they finally found Brigitta's body 250 feet from her tent. The skin on her arms had been completely peeled off up to the shoulders, and her left foot was detached from her ankle. Her muscle flesh on arms, legs, buttocks, and upper torso had been completely mauled. That evening, Brigitta Fredenhagen's remains were flown to her devastated brother and sister-in-law at the Fishing Bridge Valley. On August 3, 1984, the couple flew back to Switzerland with Brigitta's ashes. What was supposed to be a fun family vacation had turned out to be the most grotesque bear attack in the history of Yellowstone National Park. To this day, the ferocious killer bear that ended the 24-year-old's life has never been caught and is still lurking around campsites in Yellowstone, waiting to bring more unsuspecting campers to their gruesome final affliction. In the northernmost part of the planet is a frozen wilderness of pristine white where the sun never truly sets, the Arctic. The sea here is a dark, icy mirror that reflects the northern lights as they dance across the night sky. The cold winds howl over the glaciers, carving out majestic peaks and deep valleys. The land is stony and full of extremes, where survival is a struggle against the harsh elements. Only the fittest of creatures thrive here, and among them are the kings of the Arctic, polar bears. The polar bear's snow-white fur coats blend with their surroundings, providing the much-needed camouflage during hunting. They have thick layers of fat that insulate them against the freezing temperatures. Their paws are massive, providing enough traction for traversing the icy terrain. Standing at over 9 feet tall and weighing over 900 pounds, they are a terrifying symbol of the massive extent of the Arctic. However, their population has seen a massive decline, a clear indication of human activities on the planet. This has led to a rise in the number of nature reserves and conservation agencies within the Arctic as they race to fight for the preservation of wildlife and nature in the region. Johan Jacobus Kootte was a Dutch conservationist and wildlife explorer who loved animals. For years, he had lived in the most remote areas and battled with extreme weather conditions where he worked maintaining campsites for nature research and conservation groups. He had a blog where he would document his encounters in the wilderness as well as the ups and downs of living in such areas. At the height of the pandemic in 2020, Michel van Dijk contacted Johan and offered him the job of managing the Svalbard campsite in the Netherlands. Svalbard is an archipelago located in the Arctic, only 800 miles from the North Pole. With temperatures ranging from -13 Celsius to 7 Celsius, it's one of the coldest places on the planet. The terrain is covered in a blanket of ice and snow, with the only sign of life being the hardy plants that cling to the rocky soil, Arctic wildlife, and the nature reserves, among them the one Johan was managing. This icy tundra stretches far and wide as the northern lights dance in the night sky. It is a sanctuary for rare and endangered species like the Arctic fox, Svalbard reindeer, and polar bears. Here, the polar bears not only outnumber humans, but are also the most vicious and ferocious killing machines at the North Pole. They hunt and mercilessly take down any prey that fits in their food pyramid, from the chubby sea lions and seals to the occasional human. What's worse is that the number of polar bear attacks are rapidly increasing year over year. The bears are ice-dependent, and as the global temperatures rise, the ice sheets melt, making it harder for them to ambush seals. Without the ice sheets, they stand little to no chance of catching a seal while in the water. This, in return, has forced the bears to seek peculiar food sources closer to human habitation, often sighted hanging around garbage dumps, and at times they cross paths with humans, as what happened with Johan. On the evening of Thursday, the 27th August 2020, Johan stood outside his tent after a tiresome day in the freezing weather. He watched the snow-covered terrain reflect the warm colors of the setting sun. As the last rays of the sun disappeared, the purple and green auroras of the northern lights spiraled and swirled across the sky. How can such a harsh place be this beautiful? He thought to himself as he got into his tent to sleep. Inside the tent, Johan slipped into his sleeping bag and watched as the hypnotizing snowflakes danced in the soft light of his headlamp. His eyes grew heavy and his body relaxed as he gradually sunk deep into his warm sleeping bag. He slowly drifted off into sleep as the winds howled outside. The biting cold of the Arctic was not a bother as he felt at peace, lulled into deep slumber by the rhythm of nature. In the wee hours of Friday the 28th, around 4 a.m., Johan was unaware of the danger lurking outside. A massive polar bear that had breached the campsite was roaming the place. About 2 meters from the tent, the bear paused, stood on its hind legs, and tasted the chilly air. Its fur glistened in the moonlight as its glowing eyes fixed their gaze on Johan's tent. The smell of a possible meal had led it right to the tent. Sleeping, Johan didn't hear a thing as the bear approached with its paws ready to strike, and in one swipe, it tore the tent wide open from top to bottom. The bear then peeked in the tent, sniffing, throwing and spewing the tent's contents all over in an attempt to secure a meal. The commotion of the hungry bear woke Johan from his slumber. His tent had been crumpled and his items strewn over the stony, snow-covered terrain. He then saw the silhouette of the polar bear as their eyes met. For a moment, he froze. He didn't have time to slide out of his sleeping bag and run to safety. The bitterly cold air hit his face, bringing him back to reality. He quickly slid back inside his sleeping bag and zipped himself in, attempting to hide. With its mouth wide open, the bear lunged forward and clamped its jaws down on the sleeping bag. The bear's grip onto the bag allowed it to effortlessly lift and carry him. Its sharp teeth pierced the bag and tore into Johan's flesh. Johan screamed in terror as the bear began dragging him and the bag far from the tent. Unfortunately, his screams were muffled by the sleeping bag wrapped tightly around him like a cocoon. He was paralyzed with fear. Like hyenas, the scavengers of Africa, polar bears also eat their prey before killing it. Using its claws, it ripped through his clothes and sunk into his skin, leaving deep bites. The white snow stained bright red as Johan's blood spilled out. He was powerless to resist and unable to escape the deadly grasp of the bear as it relentlessly began mauling him. With a final roar, the bear swiped its claws, landing a fatal blow on Johan. Researchers and Johan's colleagues heard the growls of the bear and exited their tents armed and ready. They fired their rifles at the polar bear as it disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echoing sound of the shots fired and a motionless body of Johan. They quickly rushed to help salvage Johan's critical condition, but they were too late. He was dead. A few hours after dawn, the body of the polar bear was discovered in the parking lot of a nearby airport. It had dragged its injured body before succumbing to the shots from the incident with Johan. At the campsite, the tent had been torn open with its contents scattered on the ground, while the sleeping bag had been dragged yards away from the tent. Johan's colleagues and the locals were deeply devastated and had to undergo counseling. Authorities emphasized on the need for locals and tourists to carry weapons when outside urban areas. Campsites were also advised to erect strong bear-proof perimeters to keep away these kings of the Arctic. After all, tents in bear territories are like tissue paper in a hurricane. They stand no chance. Since 1973, the Arctic polar bears of Svalbard have been a protected species, and shooting them is only allowed as a last resort in self-defense. In 2015, a tally conducted showed that there are approximately 1,000 polar bears in Svalbard. Today, the area is dotted with placards warning about the tenacity and savagery of polar bears. Johan's attack was the first deadly incident in 9 years and the 6th fatal encounter in 50 years in Svalbard. He never wavered in his dedication to the cause, despite the harsh conditions and the nature of his work. He was a true conservationist, driven by a deep love for nature and its protection for generations to come. The death of the polar bear would have saddened him, despite it attacking him. As a hero of the Arctic wilderness, his efforts shall live on forever after his unfortunate final affliction. Grizzly bears are one of nature's most terrifying apex predators. They are the largest of the bear species and are normally found in the northwestern United States and western Canada. The average male grizzly bear can be up to 6.5 feet tall. Some grizzlies, however, have been known to reach heights of up to 9 feet and weigh as much as 1,000 pounds. Grizzly bears possess long, sharp claws that can be up to 4 inches long. They also have a very powerful jaw, and their bite force is one of the strongest when it comes to mammals. A grizzly bear's powerful bite can crush a human skull with ease. Its sharp claws can easily puncture human flesh, and its razor-sharp teeth can cut through muscle and bone. In addition to their deadly claws and teeth, grizzly bears are also known for their volatile tempers, and they can be extremely dangerous, especially when threatened. Despite their size, strength, and short temper, grizzly bears are generally shy and reclusive animals. They will usually avoid contact with humans if possible. However, grizzly bears have been known to occasionally attack humans, especially if they feel threatened or when protecting their young. If you encounter a grizzly bear, it is important to stay calm and avoid making any sudden movements. Try to back away slowly and make yourself as small as possible. Whatever you do, do not run, as this may trigger the bear's predatory instincts to give chase. This is the tragic story of Leah Lokan, the story of a strong and fearless woman who had an ill-fated encounter with this ferocious predator. Leah Davis Lokan was born on December 16, 1955, in Corona del Mar, California. She enjoyed a childhood spent horseback riding and exploring the outdoors near her home in Laguna Beach. After many years of working as a registered nurse, specializing in surgery recovery, Leah moved to California and built a home for herself in 2016. Leah's horrifying tragedy began on July 6, 2021. Leah and her sister had arrived the day before at a small town called Ovando, situated in Montana. They were taking part in an ultra-endurance cycling event that ran from Banff, Canada to New Mexico, a journey of nearly 4,000 kilometers. Leah was a competitive cyclist who took part in mountain bike races. She never let her age weigh her down, and she even won the Mammoth National Champion Enduro race in July 2015 at 59 years old. In recent years, Montana's population of grizzly bears has expanded into new areas where people now live and visit. Consequently, interactions between grizzly bears and humans have been becoming more frequent in the northern Rockies. It got so worrying that requests were even submitted to lift the restrictions preventing the killing of dangerous wild animals such as bears, not only in Montana but also in the adjacent states of Wyoming and Idaho. Upon arriving at Ovando, Leah immediately wanted to go camping outdoors. She had even found a perfect spot behind a nearby museum where she could get a phenomenal view of the beautiful night sky. Her sister and friend weren't too keen on her plan, however, as they had heard reports of a wild bear roaming nearby. Her sister pleaded with her to ditch the risky idea and stay with her at a hotel, but Leah was too stubborn to heed her sister's warnings. She set up camp next to the Blackfoot River, failing to take into consideration that it bordered a forest where more than 1,000 grizzly bears roamed free. Despite the obvious risks, Leah felt relatively safe, as she had not only brought with her a full can of bear spray, but she also met Texas couple Kim and Joe Cole, who shared her love for camping and erected their tent close by to hers, giving her a false sense of security. At 3 a.m., Leah was fast asleep when a hulking shadow appeared before her tent. Leah woke up to the sound of snuffling coming from nearby. She wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded big. The mysterious figure soon approached her tent, shrouding it in darkness with its shadow as it began sniffing where her head was located from the outside. Leah soon realized what that figure was and began screaming for help. Kim and Joe woke up to her screams and began shouting as well. The combined noise made by the trio was luckily enough to scare the bear away, as it soon retreated back into the darkness. After making sure the bear was gone, the couple ran to Leah's side to check up on her. She assured them she was fine, and they suggested it may be best for Leah to pack up her things and spend the rest of the night at a hotel for her own safety.
Officers said the food-conditioned bear showed no fear of humans and repeatedly ripped open coolers and pushed on tents in search of food.
Leah told the couple that the bear appeared to be looking around for something, and that it even huffed at her head. Apparently, that grizzly was food-conditioned. Grizzlies that are food-conditioned have learned to seek out human food, which makes them highly dangerous as they no longer fear humans and more often than not associate humans with a potential meal when they see them. This is why it is important not to store any food in your tent when camping in an area where grizzly bears are known to roam, as it will only bring them closer to you. Leah thought that by distancing herself from any sources of food that may attract a bear's attention, she could spend the rest of her night enjoying herself out in the open as she always liked. Leah scoured her tent for any crumbs of food she could find. She put inside a bag everything she thought may attract a grizzly bear's keen sense of smell, including some lentils and dried blueberries, and stored it almost 30 feet away from her tent. Finally, she thought to herself, she could sleep in peace and not have to worry. What Leah failed to consider, however, was that the containers she used to store her food prior to the previous bear encounter still reeked of blueberries, something which a grizzly bear's phenomenal sense of smell can easily pinpoint. At around 4 a.m., the Coles were yet again awoken by horrifying noises. Joe realized that the noise was coming from Leah's tent and that she was being attacked, despite not hearing her yell out for help. After exiting their tents, the couple was mortified by what they saw. They quickly pulled out their can of bear spray and rushed toward Leah, unloading on the beast as it pounced up and down on her tent. After it finally had enough, the bear let Leah go and retreated back into the woods. The Coles noticed Leah wasn't moving underneath her now destroyed tent. They ripped the torn tent away from Leah's body and were mortified by what they saw. It was Leah, now sitting motionless and bloodied, her neck and spine contorted in an unsettling fashion as the nearly 500-pound bear had come crashing down on her with all its might, likely causing instantaneous death. After arriving at the scene, investigators found an almost empty can of bear spray that seemed to have been sprayed recently right underneath her tent. Despite allegedly moving all food away, investigators discovered a small bag of dried blueberries inside her tent, as well as a saddlebag full of food that was likely overlooked by Leah just outside the entrance to her tent.
In national news, we have disturbing details this morning about a California woman who was killed by a grizzly bear in Montana. Wildlife officials say that the bear pulled her from her tent in the middle of the night and killed her before fellow campers could use bear spray and get the animal to run away.
Investigators theorized that Leah was awoken out of her sleep for the second time that night to the sight of the bear creeping inside her tent. Her sudden movements to grab her bear spray likely caused the bear to swipe at her neck as she squeezed the can of bear spray at the bear. Leah was unable to talk as the deep bleeding gashes now prevented her from screaming for help. Blinded by the bear spray while half inside Leah's tent, the bear began jumping up and down in attempts to free itself. It landed repeatedly on top of her, breaking her bones and killing her. On the 9th of July, 3 days after Leah's death, a 4 to 7-year-old bear was seen breaking into a chicken coop and was shot by officers. DNA analysis from the bear's paws confirmed that it was indeed the one who took Leah's life. The Davis family, who had lost their loved one in this tragic event, were devastated, although hopefully they can find some semblance of comfort in knowing that the beast responsible won't be hurting anyone ever again. The tragic loss of Leah Davis Lokan at the hands of a grizzly bear is a reminder of how important it is to be cautious when venturing into areas where these creatures are known to roam, no matter how well prepared you think you are when stepping into wild territory. Sometimes there's just no avoiding an encounter with a wild animal. And as the human population continues to grow and expand into areas that were once wild and unexplored, the likelihood of coming face to face with a terrifying creature continues to increase. In the end, Leah's untimely death serves as a powerful warning to not only always be aware of your surroundings and take the necessary precautions, but to also heed nature's warnings and respect the boundaries of its many dangerous creatures. Otherwise, you may end up in death's cold embrace, your life withering away before your eyes as you're handed your final affliction. Julien Gautier was a musical composer. He was inspired by the sounds of nature and often took to recording the great outdoors to include in his unique musical performances. He was born in Canada to French parents. The wilderness and great outdoors were an integral part of his upbringing, but at the age of 19, he and his family moved back to France. In 2017, at the age of 42, he secured his dream position as a composer-in-residence for the Brittany Symphony Orchestra. It was an incredible opportunity to showcase his work. The inspiration he got from the natural world was still a big part of his masterpieces. He spent 5 months on the Kerguelen Islands in Antarctica, recording the sounds of nature for his orchestral piece called Symphonie Australe, or Southern Symphony. The piece is intertwined with the sounds of penguins, seals, and the howling icy winds. A lot of preparation went into making his music. Recording the sounds was the fun part, but organizing the practical and logistical side of his travels was time-consuming. Following the success of his Southern Symphony, which was aired on French radio, he planned to visit back to his roots, Canada. The country was such a large part of his life, and having some of the sounds of home in his future work was a way of keeping Canada close to his heart. The trip was 3 years in the making, and Julien took with him biologist Camille Tuscany. The two of them planned to canoe nearly 1,000 miles down the Mackenzie River from Fort Providence to Inuvik. Along the way, Julien would be recording the sounds of the Canadian wilderness to work into his next symphony. But he would never get the chance to make his musical masterpiece. Disaster was about to strike in the worst way imaginable. The adventure was planned to take 30 days between August and September, and during that time, Camille's main job was to take photos of Julien as he made his recordings. Upon returning to France, Julien then planned to create a mini-concert around the project, with Camille's photos playing in the background. They crammed all their belongings into their 2-man canoe. Julien stashed all his sound recording equipment into watertight containers when not in use. At the end of each day, they pulled up, dragging their canoe ashore and set up camp. After eating their dinner around the campfire, they would settle into their tents, ready to take on the next leg of their journey. On August 6th, Julien updated his social media, describing the adventure through the rugged countryside as intense, tiring, and inspiring. During the same update, Julien suggested bear activity in the area. He reported that despite canoeing for 5 days, he and Camille hadn't seen a single soul for 3 of those days, except for 4 bears. Maybe this was a sign of things to come. As they canoed along through the breathtaking scenery, they were heading into some of the most remote wilderness in Canada. But halfway through their trip, something went horribly wrong. On the night of August 14th, 2019, Julien and Camille went to sleep in their separate tents. They had finished their paddling for the day, eaten dinner, and then turned in for the night. But in the darkness, something was approaching. It was drawn to the smells and the presence of 2 humans in its territory. The keen sense of smell, 100 times more powerful than a human's. Bears are thought to be able to home in on their potential prey from 20 miles away. Neither Julien nor Camille stirred. Outside their tents was a grizzly bear. It sniffed around their campsite, searching for signs of food. The sound from the river's rushing water masked any footsteps or snorts from the investigating bear. It was stealthy, curious, and it was on the hunt. A predatory bear can stalk a human undetected. Despite their immense size, they have the ability to sneak up on unsuspecting prey until they are within pouncing distance. The bear let out a low growl as it sniffed the canvas of Julien's tent. The photographer continued to sleep, unaware of the imminent danger he was in. Suddenly, it tore through the thin tent sides, its sharp, curved claws slicing through the canvas like tissue paper. A second later, and without hesitation, the bear dived inside. Before Julien could tell what was happening, he felt an immense weight on top of him, pushing him down. The claws from the bear tore into his chest, and he gasped. Then it thrust its face forwards and clamped its jaws around Julien's neck. The attack was rapid, powerful, and relentless. With no light to see what was going on, Julien grappled in the darkness. His cries were silenced by the river and by the crushing of the bear's jaws, suffocating him and making it impossible for him to cry out. Then the bear tugged, forcefully pulling Julien from his tent. He kicked with his legs, trying to get away from the animal. He punched and tried to grab the bear, pulling at it, trying to find a weak spot, but nothing he did deterred the bear. Although he tried to fight back, the bear had taken him completely by surprise, and he hadn't been able to defend himself. He had been in a deep sleep when he was pounced on, and with a bite force of around 1,000 psi, he struggled to release the bear's grip around his neck. The bear held onto Julien and dragged him away from his tent. The weight of Julien's body flattened the surrounding vegetation, leaving a trail of evidence. Blood poured from his neck as the bear's teeth severed blood vessels. He was losing blood fast and fading rapidly. With his adventure partner none the wiser and no one there to help him, he was at the mercy of the grizzly. But there isn't much one can do when a bear is in predatory mode. Most experts advise fighting back if the bear is intent on eating you, although it will likely stop at nothing. With male grizzly bears weighing in excess of 300 kilograms, 660 pounds, they are incredibly strong and powerful. A single swipe with their paw is enough to break a man's neck. The bear pulled Julien into the tree line, and moments later, Julien took his final breaths. He had lost too much blood. The injuries he sustained during the attack were unsurvivable, and he now lay motionless in the dark. The next morning, when dawn appeared on the horizon, Camille awoke from her slumber. She unzipped her tent and looked out through the flimsy canvas door. There, she saw the state of Julien's tent. It had been completely destroyed and now lay in a flattened and torn mess on the ground. Camille leapt up and jumped outside. She immediately began calling out for Julien. Her heart was in her mouth. She knew something terrible had happened to him and searched high and low for him. She could see the pools of blood around his tent. She followed the blood trail before spotting some other travelers. She ran over to them, distressed and begging for help. They had an emergency locating beacon and immediately activated it. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police received the distress beacon alert at 7:45 on the morning of August 15th. The signal was coming from 50 kilometers south of Tulita. The area was only accessible by sea and by air. The police and experts from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources flew into the area by helicopter. A search was immediately launched. There was clear evidence at the campsite of a bear attack, and now there was very little hope of finding Julien alive. Poor weather conditions hampered the search, and it wasn't until the following day that Julien's body was discovered. Camille and the group of other travelers she had made contact with for help were airlifted out of the area, physically unharmed. Members of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources located 2 bears in the area, a brown bear and a black bear. They shot both of them, and they were taken off to the labs for necropsies. Details from the findings have not been released, but it has been accepted that it was a grizzly bear that had attacked Julien. It was an incredibly tragic incident, made all the more tragic due to its rarity. Megan Wohlberg from Environment and Natural Resources said that human-bear encounters in the Northwest Territories are not uncommon, but fatalities are rare. There are estimated to be around 4,000 to 5,000 grizzlies in the Northwest Territories and a similar number of black bears. There had been 3 fatal attacks in the region since 2001. 2 of those were by black bears and 1 from a grizzly. Unfortunately, on August 6, 2017, Julien Gautier was added to those statistics of the latest bear attack victim to meet their terrifying final affliction. Michio Hoshino was born in 1952 in Ichikawa, Japan. As a teenager, he developed a passion and enthusiasm for wildlife photography. He was particularly eager to spend time in Alaska, having bought a photography book in which the village of Shishmaref was photographed. At the age of 19, he wrote to the village's mayor and received a reply 6 months later inviting him to visit. From that moment on, his career as a nature photographer was set, and he became one of the most accomplished photographers of his era, often being likened to the world-famous Ansel Adams. But tragically, his love for wildlife photography and the career path his skill and flair had paved for him led to a fearsome encounter that shook his family, friends, and colleagues. As a boy, Michio loved exploring the wilds of Japan. He was an adventurous individual who was captivated by the natural world around him, but also an avid reader of a range of different book genres. His love for storytelling and, ultimately, writing was a big part of his career as a wildlife photographer. At the age of 16, he traveled solo across North America. He visited all the big cities and the wonders of the likes of the Grand Canyon. When he returned to Japan, he attended Keio University, graduating in 1976 with a major in economics. It was during his time there that he came across the grainy photo of Shishmaref that sparked his interest in Alaska. He wanted to know how the tiny community survived in such a bleak and inhospitable environment. He had so many questions, which is why he penned a letter and simply addressed it to Mayor Shishmaref, Alaska. During one of his university summers, he spent 3 months in the Eskimo village, living with a family and getting stuck into their way of life there. He returned to the state to study wildlife biology at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He had secured some work experience with a professional photographer and put his own photography skills to the test. He would venture off to the remote Alaskan wilderness in pursuit of the perfect shots. He documented his ventures in numerous essays. He had a unique ability to bring his storytelling to life, and through it and his photos, he brought the natural world of Alaska to people in all corners of the planet. His work soon earned him prestigious awards, and it was showcased all over the world. But his final photo, or at least what was believed to be his final photo, became one of his most famous yet. It was August 1996, and Michio had been assigned to work on the filming of a documentary about brown bears. He left his wife, Naoko, and his son, Shoma, in Alaska and set off for Russia. At that time, he and Naoko had been married for 3 years. The destination for Michio and the television production crew was Kurovskoye Lake, situated on the Kamchatka Peninsula, situated in the Russian Far East. The lake is a crater lake formed from the explosion or collapse of a volcano. It is surrounded by bush and trees, mostly alder, pine, and stone birch. Back in 1996, the lake, which is a nature reserve, was thought to have the highest population of brown bears in Kamchatka, and possibly even Russia. This was precisely why Michio and his team were headed there. They were guaranteed exceptional viewing of bear activity. The documentary they planned on filming was for a Japanese television station. The team's field guide, Igor Ravenko, who was a local expert, took the team to a known bear haunt. Rumor has it the guide knew of a bear that was unafraid of humans. It continued to fish in the crystal clear waters as people approached it. This was a photographer's dream. The team were able to capture unique and up-close footage of the animal as it continued to behave in its natural way, just feet from the cameras. But 2 days later, Igor, the guide, spotted some disturbing signs around their camp. Bear scat and markings were visible in and around it. When the team had been out in the wilderness, the bear had investigated their campsite. A chill ran down Igor's spine. Were they now the hunted? On August 8th, the production team had stopped work for the day and settled down in their cabin for the night. The cabin was full, and Michio opted to sleep outside in the tent. Igor advised him against it, knowing that the bear had already ventured into their camp and was unafraid of humans. But Michio insisted on staying in his tent. Not only did he prefer being closer to the great outdoors and having his own space, but he couldn't stand the sound of other people snoring. Being under canvas just yards from the cabin was a much better option for him and would ensure he'd get a decent night's sleep, or so he thought. The day had been long, and Michio quickly nodded off to sleep, warm in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of nature. But in the darkness outside, something stirred. It was a large grizzly bear that was prowling the surrounding woodland. It sniffed the air, the scent of the production team carried on the wind. It walked nearer, coming in for a closer look. Michio continued to sleep, unaware that his dreams were about to come crashing to an end. At 4 a.m., just before the milky haze of the dawn light, the bear sniffed outside Michio's tent. It snorted, and the vegetation under its heavy paws rustled the other side of the canvas. Its long snout was inches from Michio's face. He suddenly woke. The rustles, the deep-throated growling, and the loud sniffs had risen him from his slumber and had alerted him to the danger outside. He held his breath, listening and waiting. His mind was racing, and his heart began thundering in his chest. There was no way of alerting the others inside the cabin. All Michio could do was stay still and silent, hoping that the bear would lose interest and walk away. But the bear had other ideas. It had smelt something inside the tent, Michio himself. Suddenly, it slashed through the canvas with its front paws. There was nothing to protect Michio from the beast. It was in predatory mode, intent on securing its prey rapidly. Michio cried out in alarm and kicked at the face of the bear as it lunged through the canvas. His screams were heard by his colleagues in the cabin. Their guide, Igor, heard the commotion unfolding outside. It was 4 a.m. He opened the cabin door to see the back end of an enormous grizzly sticking out of Michio's tent. The bear was mauling the photographer, and Igor shouted, "Tent! Bear! Tent!" Everyone leapt out of their beds and ran outside. Michio was putting up a fight, but the bear bit down on him repeatedly, tearing flesh and biting into bone. He was powerless in the mighty beast's jaws. It shook its head from side to side, and Michio was thrown around like a rag doll. His colleagues were just 10 meters away. The tent had collapsed under the bear's weight, and underneath the canvas, Michio was grappling with the grizzly. Immediately, Igor grabbed a metal bucket and a spade. He ran towards the dilapidated tent and the ensuing attack, hitting the two items together. They crashed and banged in the night, the metal on metal ringing in their ears, but by the illumination of their flashlights, the bear didn't even flinch. Instead, it tugged and pulled at Michio, dragging him from his sleeping bag and into the dark, cold night. The others shouted at the animal, but it was in vain. It dragged Michio into the woodland and out of sight. His cries died down, and his friends knew that he had likely succumbed to his injuries, but in the darkness, they couldn't see anything. They had to wait until first light before they could track him down. They found his body in the woodland. It was a devastating finding and traumatic for those involved. The attack had happened so quickly and was thought to have been an exceedingly rare predatory attack. The noise from those who witnessed the attack and tried to intervene didn't deter the bear as it normally would. As news spread about the terrible incident, a photograph emerged on the internet and went viral. It was a disturbing image, and the caption claimed that it was the last photo Michio had taken on his camera. In the photo, an aggressive grizzly bear peers in through the open door of a tent. It's a terrifying image showing the bear's long canines and dominant stance, apparently seconds before it launched its attack on Michio. But it is, in fact, a fake. The lighting on the animal is different from that on the tent. Outside is broad daylight when the attack occurred at around 4 a.m. Although Russia's north does experience daylight nights, in August on the Kamchatka Peninsula, sunrise is between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning. It was found that it was a Photoshop photograph which was entered into a competition called Worth 1000 Photoshop. It was entered under the category entitled Hoax Last Photo Taken Before Death. Those who knew Michio only had the nicest things to say about him. He was an incredibly humble and modest man. When meeting somebody new for the first time, he would ask them about their story and listen intently, rather than talking about himself. In 1992, he founded the Aurora Club, which gives youths in Japan the chance to experience Alaska. His hope was that it would enrich their lives just as it had for him. Now, 3 decades later, the club is still running, and Michio continues to inspire the younger generation, as his photos and written works are still used throughout Japan today, such as in school textbooks. Michio was missed by so many that 12 years after Michio's death, his life was commemorated at Halibut Point State Recreation Area, just north of Sitka. Woodcarver Tommy Joseph carved a totem pole out of a red cedar tree. Depicted in it was Michio at the bottom, holding his beloved camera, and above him were the animals he loved to photograph. A fitting tribute to an inspiring man who left this planet too soon after meeting his terrifying final affliction. The Run Amok Campground near Hyder, Alaska is a very popular viewing place for bears and has been for many years. By the year 2000, the townspeople of Hyde had long since gotten used to the slew of tourists coming in to catch a glimpse of the majestic grizzly and brown bears. And surprisingly, most of the people coming through aren't tourists. They're their own people, city slickers who wanted to get a taste of nature, but from a safe vantage point. The campgrounds around Hyder have many viewing posts, built several meters above the ground with bridge lookouts that have heavy gates at either end. These seemingly simple safety measures are actually very effective, and it's the reason that the area only had 3 attacks from bears since the 60s. Those unlucky individuals were usually foolish city folk who thought for some inexplicable reason that it was safe to walk up to a wild bear to pet it, and one unfortunate hunter who just happened to stumble upon a mother bear and her cub. But for the most part, Hyder is one of the best and safest places to visit, despite the many, many bears that call the surrounding woods home. In the weeks leading up to July 18, 2000, Hyder experienced a rather unruly new inhabitant, a 300-pound brown bear that made it its business to terrorize the town. The permanent inhabitants weren't unfamiliar with the occasional bear wandering into town, and in the past, they simply kept out of the animal's way for a few days until it decided on its own that the woods were much more peaceful than a place with cars and noisy sawmills that were the main source of income for the 140 residents. But this bear wasn't so easily deterred. Determined to get its hands on every garbage can and scrap of food it could reach, it made quite a nuisance of itself and caused a fair bit of damage during its searches for food. After a week of hoping that the animal would finally give up and leave its nightly ventures into town behind it, hunters were finally deployed to locate the bear when it nearly attacked an employee of one of the sawmills one evening. The woman stepped out of her house to take out the trash and walked straight into the animal rummaging through their trash can. Luckily, her front door was just feet away, and she managed to make it inside unharmed. The very next night, it again tried to attack another resident who had let his dog out. This man was chased from his front yard back into his cabin, where he was forced to shut the door before his dog could make it inside too. Whether or not the bear killed the dog is unknown, but the mutt was never seen again. But the trackers were having a difficult time finding the animal. Those woods are full of bears, and distinguishing it from the rest wasn't going to be an easy task. All they could do was wait until it made an appearance in town again and hope that someone isn't killed. George Tulous was in Hyder for the summer, working part-time at the sawmill. Since the 41-year-old was only staying for a few months, he'd set up a tent at Camp Runamuck. He and the other seasonal workers knew each other well, since the other 5 men living at the camp all worked in Hyder every summer too. Their days were long and hard, and by the time the evening came around there were no rowdy parties or late nights. They all took their turns at the campground's facilities to wash up and headed off to bed, just to start the next day all over again. Friday night was a night like every other. George got back, dusty, tired, and wanting nothing more than a shower and a warm meal. After his turn at the shower, he cooked his food in front of his tent and crawled into his warm bed less than 2 hours after he got off work. In his haste to get to sleep, George left his dishes right next to the dwindling coals, with plans to clean up in the morning before he went to work. It was those tasty-smelling dishes that drew the hungry animals straight into his camp. Near the morning hours, long after the fire had burned out, George heard the rummage and shuffle outside his tent. Furious and expecting to find someone stealing his things, George wasted no time to rip open the tent's zipper and storm out into the night, ready to let fists fly to protect his possessions. Whatever George expected, it certainly wasn't a 300-pound brown bear, with George's dinner plate held to its face, licking off the flecks of ketchup left over from dinner. The bear was so startled that it dropped the plastic plate in shock, just as George stumbled backwards, falling back into his tent, hitting the ground hard. George flipped over on his stomach and attempted to stand up, but then his feet, which were still outside the tent's flap, were grabbed, and he was ripped out so fast that he had no time to react. He flew through the air and hit the ground again, landing a full 9 yards away in the dirt. George only managed to utter a single cry before the snarling beast pounced on top of him, landing with such force on his chest that it shattered his sternum and most of his ribs, sending shards of bone into his lungs. With his entire chest crushed to the point that nothing but blood and fluid was rushing into them, George couldn't yell for help. He couldn't scream in pain as the monstrosity above him began to tear and slash at his face. George was thrown around like a rag doll, limply going where the bear was throwing him. With no oxygen to fuel his lungs, George could not fight back. He was utterly defenseless. In the few minutes it took for George to succumb to the incredible abuse his body was being put through, one of the other campers woke briefly, hearing the grunting of what was obviously a very large animal. The man lay awake for a few seconds, listening to what he thought was a bear rooting through someone's trash. It wouldn't be the first time that one of the beasts lumbered into camp searching for food, and if no one was making a ruckus, it was understood that it was best to leave the animal alone, and it would head back to the trees before the morning came. And since George was unable to make any sound to alert the other people, the man just rolled over and went back to sleep. He was 60 yards away from George's camp, and what he could hear was far enough in the distance that it didn't worry him all that much. What finally killed George is uncertain. It could have been his shattered chest, the claws that raked across his throat, or his shattered skull as the animal slammed him into the hard ground over and over again. Maybe it was blood loss and shock, or a combination of all of those things. But what is certain is that his death came in less than 3 minutes after he was pulled from his tent. The next morning, the man who'd heard the sounds that night walked past George's camp, hoping to share a cup of coffee with his colleague. He saw the blood in the open tent flap and immediately raised the alarm. The 5 workers set out to look for George, and they found him laying by the tree line of the forest 12 yards behind his tent. His body, or what was left of it, was an absolute mess. The bear had begun to eat at George, but apparently decided that it was too much effort to carry him away to a hiding spot to finish off later, like bears usually do. The news spread along the radio, and rangers were called in from the neighboring towns. But before they could even make it to Hyder, the bear was spotted at a nearby sawmill's dump site. The workers who saw it knew from one look that it was the very animal that had killed George. Its muzzle was still caked in blood, and there were bits of George's flesh stuck in its fur. The workers picked up their rifles and shot at it as it was upending a trash can. They weren't going to wait for the rangers. It had evaded capture, traps, and trackers for nearly 2 weeks. If they didn't take their chance now, then it would just get away again. Only after it lay dead on the ground did they call it in, and the rangers' only job was to transport it to the coroner's, where it lay in the same room as its victim while the necropsy was delivered. And as expected, the proof was in the bear's stomach. All of the pieces that were missing from George were retrieved from its digestive tract and returned to its owner. George was the 4th and last person around Hyder to meet their terrifying final affliction.